Welcome to another good cast by yours truly, Mr. Goody. And what I'm going to be doing tonight is telling you the conclusion of the Frozen story. We last left off with Brandon and Richard, his uncle, who was in the hospital due to severe frostbite, and he was in terrible condition. Well, this is how the story ends. You see, Brandon was there to watch over his uncle in the hospital. He had heard all the doctors talking about that this is the worst case of frostbite that they had ever seen in the history of the hospital. Like in over 100 years, they had never seen anything like this before. And this was all going to go to court. An investigation was going to be open, and it was going to be found out why Brandon's uncle Richard was left in such horrible condition. How did he get this way? What happened? What led up to this point? Well, I can tell you that Richard continued to recover. They kept him in the hospital for probably 4 months, and then they sent him to a rehabilitation center. I know that Brandon promised Richard one day that, he was like telling him to hang in there and telling him positive things and trying to reinforce positivity to hang on to life and to live and to want to keep striving to be here. Brandon talked about, going fishing with his uncle one day. And, memories in the future that haven't been made yet. So, as time went by, there was an investigation done on Gramps, which was Richard's grandfather. Or not Richard's grandfather, Brandon's grandfather. I get all these names confused, sorry. But they went to court and they found Brandon's grandfather incompetent and not mentally let's see, what is the wording here I'm looking for? Not mentally responsible for what had happened to Richard. Over a period of years, Richard's dad, which would be Brandon's grandfather, his mind had slowly deteriorated, and he didn't even know that Richard was that bad. He thought that Richard just had the flu, and he'd went to Brandon's mom's house, which was Brandon's grandfather. Brandon's mom was his grandfather's daughter. There we go. Got it right. Okay. So what eventually happened was Brandon's grandparents were ruled incompetent and unable to take care of themselves because of this incident, and there was no jail time. As if they were found competent, they would have probably have spent time in prison. But none of that happened. Brandon didn't have to testify or anything of that nature. The police had went and took video of the property that Brandon's grandpa had lived on, and they found out that there was no running water. It was an old shack that had a foundation of limestone. It had there they must have been hoarders because everything on the property, there were so many things that was hoarded. From old cars, old junk cars was everywhere. It was like from every decade that they were there. And they had dogs inside of the cars. And the dogs had been fed through the cars for who knows how long. It looked for like a very long time because the seats, they were dilapidated. And what I mean by dilapidated, they were broken down. And all you could see from the seats and interior in the car, the seats were just springs that were left. The leather or the cotton or the vinyl, they were all gone, kind of rotted away from years of these, lack of better words, them using these vehicles as dog kennels. And the windows inside of these vehicles were rolled down about this much, a couple of inches, so that the dogs, when they got really hot in the summertime, that they could put their like nose up to the window and that they could breathe, get us some fresh air out of those windows. And they would be fed every day in those cars. So there were some vehicles like that. And then also on the land, there were actually a real dog kennel where there was a gate made and there was a lot of dogs in there. Also, all over the property, there were cats everywhere. And some of these cats, and I'm not trying to say this as a joke or just trying to throw this in there for no reason, but one of the cats had one eye. And seriously, you could see into its eye socket, like its eye wasn't even closed. You could see like the eye socket, like where the bone and everything is, and it was kind of creepy, and it was pretty scary, especially if you were a kid and you saw something like that. But what had happened is, where they lived out in the country and beside of a dirt road and had so many pet animals, that the cats, they were never really caged up. They could just walk wherever. And a lot of these cars going down the road would run over the cats. And sometimes the ones that survived, there was one that would have like 3 legs or the cat with one eye. I mean, that's what would happen. And these cats would survive and they were fed. It's just they were a little maimed and so forth and so on. You get it, what I'm trying to say here. Well, see, what ended up happening to Brandon's grandparents, they had to go and live in a rest home since they were ruled incompetent. And because of this, everything at that property had to be cleaned up and gotten rid of, especially all of the live animals. And I'm not for sure on the count of how many each of cats and dogs there were. I would probably say there were close to 40-something dogs and probably equally as many cats, like 40-something cats. But what had happened was a lot of the cats, it was said, had tested positive for feline leukemia, and I think 80% of them were put down by the dog pound. And some of the dogs, it was really horrible because it was a different story with the dogs, because when they released the dogs, or when they were rounding them up for the dog catcher, the dog pound, when the dog catcher was rounding them up for the dog pound, what happened was, like, the dogs in this car or an old Volkswagen van or an old station wagon, you see, once they were taken out, they never seen each other before, these dogs. So it was like these dogs were strangers to each other, even though they lived on the same property for years. So what had happened, like, actually, I believe there was I think it was a German Shepherd, if I remember correctly, and there was like a little Chihuahua. And unfortunately, these two got close to each other, and they were from different parts of the property. And the German Shepherd attacked and mortally wounded. That's how I will put it. The little Chihuahua, and in a very gruesome way that I'd rather not describe on here. And it was just terrible that, the dog catcher then realized that, hey, these animals don't know each other. These animals are wild. He would have to take extra caution when rounding these dogs up. And after they got all of the animals from this place, then they had to tow all of these junk cars away. And there were quite a bit of them. And then they had a bulldozer to clean up all the trash and old junk refrigerators and old junk bicycles, old junk. There was like lawnmowers and rotillers, parts of water tanks. There was just all kinds of different kinds of junk, TVs and everything, and a bulldozer kind of bulldozed all that up so that they could take all that garbage away. But inside, to this very day, the shack still remains, full of its contents: newspapers, TV guides, old milk jugs, old tobacco pouches, empty snuff cans, very old refrigerator littered with newspapers and old cups and just old dolls and toys, and just stacked, probably about 6 feet high and an 8-foot tall ceiling. And it's just everywhere to this very day. And whatever happened to Richard? Sadly, Richard did survive, and Richard did experience somewhat of a good life, and he's still alive to this day. But sadly, even in state custody, they promised Richard prosthetic legs and rehabilitation, and promised him that he would walk again, because his legs were amputated to right below the knee. And so he is bound to a wheelchair. And to this very day, they never rehabbed him enough to learn to walk again. And that is very sad. And he never got to see his dad really again until at his mother's funeral. You see, Brandon's grandma has passed away since then, and Richard got to see his father one more time, and that was at his mother's funeral. Which I don't know how Richard feels about seeing his father, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. Whether it brought up bad memories of the whole incident of where he was frostbit or not. But Richard is well fed and he is taken care of. And he stays in a rehabilitation center / assisted care living facility, and he has friends there, And that's where he lives into this very day. And all of this started in April the 16th of 1996. And today is May the 21st of 2023. So it's been quite a while, many, many years, decades. But that is a true story of a man who became the victim of parents who lost touch with reality, as he himself didn't have all of his mental faculties, and he was able to become victim to this horrible situation. Anyways, that concludes the story of the man that was frozen. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.